Hello, everyone. Whoa, that's loud. How's everyone doing? Good, good, good. Thank you all for being here and taking the time to join us in the second of an amazing lineup of lectures and events that we have this fall. Tonight we welcome Maya Lam. Maya Lam is a German-born architect and designer. She holds the title of Diploma of Engineering of Interior Architecture from Peter Behrens School of Architecture in Düsseldorf in Germany, and a Master of Architecture with distinction from the Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles. She has worked internationally in Germany, India, Switzerland, China, Italy, and the United States, with offices such as Patterns, Marcelo Spina and Georgina Hulich, NMDA, Neil Denari, UN Studio, and Studio Fuxas. She has taught at SCIARC, Syracuse University, Yale University, and she's currently a full-time faculty at the University of Pennsylvania, Weizmann School of Design. Maya was awarded the AIA Henry Adams Certificate, and her project received the Best Thesis Award at SCIARC in 2012. In 2016, she was the inaugural recipient of the Bogosian Fellowship at Syracuse University. Maya, along with Daniele Profeta, founded AP Practice, and in their projects they combine everyday digital habits, contemporary imaging technologies, and traditional craftsmanship to surpass an introverted conversation and open up novel forms of practice. The work ranges from small-scale public installations to site of speculative reuse while weaving existing conditions with contemporary manufacturing technologies and aesthetics. They engage in the heterogeneous, often contradictory set of evidence of a given context. They focus on constructing inclusive interventions that embrace and critically address the multifaceted nature of our reality. I have had the pleasure of knowing and interacting with Maya over the years and in many different settings, but I can say that it's not often that you meet someone who you deeply appreciate as a friend and highly respect as a peer. But more importantly, someone that you admire for her uncompromising commitment to design and her craft, while maintaining such a high level of intellectual engagement. Please join me in welcoming Maya Lam.
Right. Thank you, Yvonne. That was really nice. And thank you, Ken, for having me. There was a moment yesterday where I was like, there's going to be like 3 people here, maybe 5, the 5 guys who helped us. Thank you for that, by the way. And thank you, John and Jean, for organizing everything over the summer. I know at times we probably didn't make it as easy as it could have been. All right. I would like to start with the question of the color gray, or why do I ask you to stare at a gray screen? One could argue that the world we live in cannot be understood as a singular entity. The gray area in between happens to be our current reality, or one could argue it's always our reality, but now we're talking about it. Here I usually like to talk about Enoch Brata, who's a scholar who wrote extensively on Samuel Beckett's affinity to the color gray. He says, quote, "Gray supports spatial, visual, and narrative ambiguity, and its effects highlight the conditional states that characterize the subject, object, and image alike. Gray, grayness, graying." And maybe I'll play this one while I'm talking. Gray as a verb, as a noun, as an adjective, as a process, evoke an enigmatic world that is neutral and unstable, an indeterminate zone fading from darkness to light, then suddenly back again. An end point that is always on the verge of becoming something else again. Gray is both a beginning and an end. Diminution as well as potential. An imperfect lessness at best, depending on how you might look at it. Gray, when it stands stoutly and proudly on its own, can also be more than enough to sustain an entire fictional world. So all of the projects, hopefully, that we're talking about, just trying to establish these fictional worlds.
How do you forget to erase your sex tape?
Because it kept slipping my mind, and then the next thing I knew, it went up. It went up to the cloud.
And you can't get it down from the cloud?
Nobody understands the cloud.
So just as a disclaimer, while this clip is in no way a suggestion of what you should watch tonight. I think it has like 2.5% on Rotten Tomatoes. But I really like the scene. I think it's funny. But it also talks about these ever-growing, multi-layered digital presences of our real-time social networking reality. We're more than ever confronted with the multiplicity of, as well as our actual presence in it. So sense of place and reality is challenged to a disorienting degree at times. And we might want to talk about how, yes, it's disorienting, but maybe also productive disorientation. So if you talk about what is the cloud, according to the Dictionary of Psychology, a cloud experiment is, quote, if two clouds just noticeably different in grayness are observed through smoked glass, they cease to be indistinguishable, unquote. This might be an ambitious sort of endeavor, but let's try to participate in a cloud experiment together here. The cloud experiment was believed to be a way to illustrate the Weber-Fechner law, which refers to a hypothesis in the field of psychophysics, linking human perception to the difference between actual change in a physical stimulus and the perceived change, which, this is from 1860. You can imagine that the perceived stimulus or the actual stimulus versus perceived realities is drastically exaggerated these days. The other thing that we find interesting about this is that most of the illustrations are actually not clouds, they're points, point diagrams. In fact, one could say that points play an important role in the history of visuality. During Impressionism and Pointillism, they were devised to delineate the contrast and alignments between what we see and how we see it in an attempt to investigate the mechanics of vision, which might be a little bit of a different reading than just pure abstraction, so really an understanding of how much can you take away to see the world. It was during the post-war period that Max Wertheimer's work at the Berlin School of Gestalt Psychology leveraged them as graphic elements to understand part-to-whole relationships, which in turn is believed by at least some to be central to Bauhaus's design pedagogy. So these woven pieces by Annie Albers are interesting to us because, for one, they're beautiful, I think, but Albers not only took virtual points in space in order to move fluidly to lines, planes, and volume, she also used hybrids of materials. This one with metal is interwoven with metal threads to experiment with multivalent readings of a contemporary condition. So another example, sort of during the same time, mainly during the 50s and 60s, is this phenomenon called RIPS, or X-ray X-ray audio. We find this helpful to highlight some of the logics that we talk about in our work, or we think about when we talk about our work. In fact, we actually found one piece on eBay, and it's part of the exhibition now. So these things are essentially X-rays. So in response to the Soviet Union censoring access to everything, among other things, music, a subculture of bootleggers developed techniques to blend band gramophone recordings with used X-ray images. But the inherent need for self-expression produced artifacts operating across multiple materialities where they become enclouded inscriptions to challenge the status quo. Somehow my hair's falling apart while I'm talking. It's supposed to be without sound. These are visuals by the European Space Agency that just published this last year. And it's everything. I mean, the scale is obviously blown up for visualization, but this is everything that is currently circulating around our planet. So here, machine vision is instrumental in the construction of our contemporary visual language and the transformation of ever-growing data sets of partial images in three-dimensional machine-readable survey models are affecting subjects and objects alike. So really, why I think this thing that is part of our life that we don't see is so fascinating. It actually has something to do with objects. It has actually something to do with matter and materiality, although we don't see it, right? So what are the implications of satellites or dead satellites circulating around? Another example is the work shown here is it's an excerpt of studies that, that begin to speculate on seeing or maybe machine seeing by embracing a lack of focus, so going back to gray or clouds. The Google Images algorithm was used to simulate the delusion of what we see through multiplication. Every time an image was searched for, the second from the left image became the new search object, and so on. So you know how you can drag something in there. Depending on the contrast of the first image, this process would happen fast or slow, but inevitably, it would end in gray, cloudy matter. I obviously accelerated that due to the fact that I started with a gray subject, but ultimately, a pretty iconic piece by Warhol, right? This is just a gray slide, nothing will happen. They will come once in a while. So as part of the gray cloud experiment, I will use these as sort of visual cleansers to give you guys a break from all the stuff that I overflow you with. This is the oldest surviving camera photo we have on record. A pewter plate coated with an asphalt derivative was used to capture the view from a window. On the other hand, this one is the altered version of the same image, or this is the image of the photo, to actually make it legible, revealing, letting the materiality disappear, but revealing sort of gray matter or points, and through this, new readings and new relationships. Marble-ish was my final project that we worked on as part of the Harry Bogosian Fellowship. It is set in the so-called Marble Room in Syracuse University. It's, as the name said, all marble. And here we started challenging sort of traditional notions of scanning technologies. So while these traditional scanning projects understand their output as absolute truth, if you go to the LiDAR scanner website or any of these commercially now available things that talk about how you can solve crime and anything with it, really. We're more interested in the truth that lies in between. So we see this exhibition as a site for a different kind of contextualism. So how do you challenge this? This one, is it this one? Yes, sorry. This is the first time I'm presenting with 3 slides. So bear with me when I do this, but starting with this one. This one shows a little bit of these digital operations that we went through to see this entire show as an active landscape and install certain pieces, but also simultaneously keep questioning the scanner's ability to accurately document and through that sort of start to picture a new kind of understanding of the real. So as such, this installation allows us to speculate on the potential of many new depictions of the real, all brought together in a single mediated space. So aside from the installation that I just showed, the drawings of these exhibition produce a couple of artifacts. These model drawings that attempt to find connections in the drawings for three-dimensional form making. So how do you start dealing with the plethora of data points that you have and confronted with the knowledge of, or the preconception we have about projective geometry. And then these drawing models that are essentially the output of what that analysis was. And ultimately they were 3D printed with a 3D paper printer. So they're in themselves sort of layered, thick drawing images, models, conflating the sort of medium of what that is. And these sort of white streaks are sort of an intentional carving out the original materiality, sort of revealing the hybridization. It's essentially extremely cheap copy paper. Cleansing slide. So one could argue that modes of vision were always synonymous with modes of power. If you're not familiar with these, they're sort of the go-to graphics for at least some architects. These are examples of dazzle camouflage that was predominantly used in World War I, a little bit in World War II, to conceal the movement of U-boats from the enemy. So while we might have the urge to conform and blend in with our surroundings in order to feel connected, one could talk about sort of the us as humans, but also us as architects to an over affinity with contextualism, because it makes us feel safe and justified. Camouflage can also be used to create difference and establish identity. So however much these modes of vision influence what and how we see the world, in turn, they can also be used against one another. So as the points and aggregated clouds of 3D scans are constructing the figure of our cities, this project Streetscape acts both as a reflection on the contemporary image of the city as well as a catalyst of transformation and its unfolding exchange with the surrounding context. Art objects, as much as commercial storefronts, are often understood exclusively through the relationship that they establish with their viewer. And while the Downtown Syracuse Revitalization Committee commissioned us to install these pieces in office fronts that were difficult to rent out, this public art installation aimed to blur the relationship between subject and object and is meant as a visual disruption of the modes we are all too familiar with. So we used the point cloud we had from the downtown LiDAR scan that we did for originally did for the Syracuse Science Museum as building material, and created these prints that, once installed, weave the digital and the physical image of the city into one. And ultimately, it worked for the revitalization committee as well, because all of these spaces are rented out now. So similar to late 18th century drawings by mountaineers, such as this one by Burit, we're interested in thinking about what new narratives about the environment can be constructed when we begin to see the world beyond human eye level, temporarily displacing ourselves from the central point perspective, thinking of the Renaissance into something else. This is obviously not new. It's from 1785, but maybe a good thing to remind ourselves once in a while. So referencing a long lineage of urban imagery in the form of panoramas, this one, for example, Rundumsicht by Karl August Richter, talks about the construction of the city Dresden through an elevated point of view. One could argue that that is related to Google Street View, and it does shape the perception of our built environment, right? These immersive bubbles let us virtually leap with a click of the mouse, maneuvering into a 360-degree panoramic image constructed by means of omnidirectional cameras mounted on a variety of vehicles moving across publicly accessible territory of the world. So however many photos, and these modes of vision are as much defined by what is represented as well as what is not, by the space in between the points, by public versus private, by the fact that Google is still a corporation and not just a direct translation of what we understand as true. We tested these observations in this project called Casa 2. And it's based on the fact that in recent years, following a statewide initiative, the administration of the city of Rome developed a plan called Piano Casa, Plan House, aiming to address the ever-growing housing demands while simultaneously contrasting the excessive sprawl in the Campagna Romana. To be fair, we did it in a semi-central part of Rome, one that is already sort of fragmented in the way new and old comes together. So in this project, we are posing the questions of what influences a platform of vision, such as Google Street View, can have an articulated urban artifact, a representation strategy to inform building postures or buildings in dense environments, and how do we start reading those? So the established street facade acts as much of a disruption as it camouflages itself in the collected data. While these assembled textures from the 3D scans become substrate for drawings and build materials alike, these sectional qualities that we're studying here are defined by a point poché, a poché generated from the machine's cones of vision that conceals its private interior. So again, how do you start combining not new architectural language back into these seemingly new observations or new phenomena that we're trying to talk about? So again, architecture has always been closely entangled with modes of vision and its devices. However, most were a product of Western worldviews, placing the individual at the center of its ideological construct, very directly in this case. This was a proposition by Alberti in his treatise on sculpture, and one could argue one of the sort of scanning prototypes. At the time, nobody understood what he was talking about. Using a measuring device centered above the top of the body to be actually measured, spatial coordinates would be documented in order to create identical copies, virtual casts that then could travel around. Which in the age of prefabrication, that's a completely different kind of understanding, right? Or this one, Albrecht Meidenbauer was a young German architect and one of the first ones who suggested that multiple photographic images could be used for the documentation of buildings. He called these Denkmalarchiv, the archive of cultural heritage, in order to record cultural heritage in such a way that they could be reconstructed in case of destruction, so foreseeing things to come. He later established the so-called Messbildanstalt, the Institute for Measured Images, which in and on itself was seen as the precursor for photogrammetry as we know it today. Because today, we kind of take that for granted, but the multitude of machine eyes pointing at us are shaping the way we see ourselves and our place in the world. So it's not necessarily only the way we use this world, or we use it in this world, and how we then represent that world, but also the fact that we're using it in that way affects us, right? I'm a little bit sad that this music piece is not playing. There was supposed to be Bob Dylan's All Along the Watchtower playing, but maybe that's too much of an inside joke anyways. Nerd. But I think it's important to mention this. Like yes, the site of this project is a watchtower. The title All Along the Watchtower is a song by Bob Dylan, released in 1967, and was extremely popular. What I think is interesting about this, that it became, among other things, famous for provoking speculations on reshuffling timelines and inverting its own narrative while it was going. So in this case, the project Watchtower, or All Along the Watchtower, positions itself at the interface between new media and architectural revitalization in order to challenge certain semantic tropes that are produced when dealing with historic or digital artifacts in a monolithic way. Asking the question of who decides what gets preserved, how do we preserve it? Again, who controls that image of preservation and essentially controls the way we understand the world around us, right? The site is a watchtower erected around the 800th century. It's part of the recent public initiative Valore Paese by the Italian State Property Office, aimed to revitalize abandoned state-owned properties in the rural landscape. Sorry, got lost in my notes. So the question we are asking here is, what do we do with all the data that comes out of a site scan like that? How can it produce new modes of drawings or new understanding of how these data sets are, and we just talked about that in our conversation over a lot of coffee with the grad students. So much coffee. The question was, when do you decide how many points are enough? And I think in our case we would say, when your computer tells you that it cannot process it anymore, but also because it means that you unlearn certain preconditioned things, right? You cannot fall back into certain tropes of the image of the tower that you understand as in it on itself. So we looked a little bit deeper into that. How can the computer's navité help us in understanding the existing historical composition of a site, not through our preconceptions, but how can we exploit that to provoke unexpected outcomes? So, yeah, an unlearning, essentially. So the established singular profiles of the tower are dislodged by an image classification algorithm whose aim is to identify pixels most likely to be part of characteristic stone construction of the site. Again, this is not a smart system. It doesn't know what it looks at. And then in order to assemble them together in a series of figure outlines. This subversive database becomes the base of a series of automated tentative projections and solid intersections, recasting new figures on the existing tower. Guided by an approximation towards a specific volumetric addition to the existing structure, this streamlined process activates the survey image as loose generators of unexpected compositions, or loose compositions. Ultimately, with this project at least, we're not saying that any of the individual outcomes are singularly understood as prepackaged projects. So we're not interested in revisiting any of the sort of early 2000s understanding of you just put in a script and there you go, architecture. But rather they partake in an archive of elements that are utilized to intervene in the site. So again, how do you start using them to question certain preconceptions that you have? In the survey and its images if the survey and its images are instrumentalized to reshuffle the figure of the Watchtower, this project leverages the pixel as the smallest building brick we operate in. So if you're familiar with photogrammetry, it constructs three-dimensional data through flat images and then gives you another flat image, which is the texture that it puts back onto it. So as such, the displacement, multiplication, and mirroring in the digital space defined by the photogrammetry model becomes a methodology for texture composition, suggesting new material associations and qualities, and essentially allowing for speculations on other worlds. Cleansing slide.
No one starts eating until father has served himself. Always wait for the hostess, in this case mother, to begin eating before you start. Let father and mother guide the conversational trend if they desire. After all, they made all this possible and may want to talk over their day with each other. Tell mother how good the food.
This is actually not Leave It to Beaver. We're going back and forth which one to use for this. This is a 1950s educational video on how to behave, how a good family behaves or was understood or believed to behave. And yeah, it's highly problematic, I think. We find this interesting because should have probably stopped at a better end, but if you think about it, the dinner table is an active participant in our visual culture, but in architecture, we talk about chair studies, right? Chair studies have a long history in proto-design explorations of architecture, such as Mies van der Rohe, Marcel Breuer, Oskar Niemeyer, to name just a few. Investigations on tables haven't received as much attention. While chairs are concerned with the individual's design ambitions and the individual's body, tables act as a social representative for our collective consciousness. They can be understood as a connective tissue between us and the world around us. So Louis Bourgeois' installation, The Destruction of the Father, directly addresses the video that we just seen before, the often false image of the picture-perfect family by merging private and the semi-public into one homogeneous scene and ultimately a spatial installation. Or this one, Indigestion by Diller, Scofidio, and Renfo, is a semi-interactive video of a table scene projected on a horizontal table, which questions freedom of choice in interactive digital environments. So taking the preconceptions of the 1950s scene and start to counterposition them with ideas that we have today. So while Tabula non rasa is more of a formal exploration and in no way challenges the nuclear family, but it starts to challenge tabula rasa. So how do you start dealing with preconceptions and understandings of what is the table, how is it used, what is materiality, and what is used. So in that sense, tabula non rasa weaves local materiality with new imaging technologies, traditional with digital fabrication craft. Sort of similar to the Tower project, we began with a high-resolution scan of an essentially unusable site. In this case, a piece of wood that was riddled by carpenter ants. The project places itself in between postmodern contextualism and the modernist tabula rasa approach in weaving local material with new imaging. Yeah, again, I think in no way do we think this is challenging the family structures, but understanding that looking at a table allows us to deal with conditions of collectivity, I think is interesting. And then we produced these videos as sort of additional artifacts. We're calling these drone footage, or like virtual drone footage. They allow for a closer examination of the detailed processes that occur when the digital alters the physical and the physical affects the digital. This is Charles Eames's drawing in the magazine in the Arts and Architecture magazine, posing the question, what is the house? And through that, launching the case study program of exhibition houses in Los Angeles. That's not the right date. As you might have noticed, I'm using these slides to launch projects or as precursors for projects. For this one, we find Beatrice Colominer's understanding of this image that she frames in The Exhibitionist House useful. She says, quote, "In the 20th century, we are faced with two striking phenomena, and the case study program is paradigmatic of this. Here we can start to see a way to think about the architecture of the century without reducing it to a series of masterpieces. Rather than a comprehensive survey, it is like a family photograph. a family photograph album, that's important, a small section from thousands of snapshots which attempts to capture the different media in which architects have built their houses and the effects that those media have had on the architecture, unquote. So again, we had a really good conversation about that in, or I thought it was a good conversation, in the coffee with students discussion that we had before this lecture, talking about how the very many can become productive to overcome understandings of singularity and autonomy, and really understand more as a set of pieces that everyone can read more than one thing into it. Yeah. This is a close-up of a record player playing under a microscope, or a close, like very, very close-up. And it's obviously tying back to the X-ray audio piece that I showed in the beginning of this talk. Similar to that, in that case I was talking about the image and the culture, or the image body. This one very literally connects physical and metaphysical materiality, and mechanically conflates everything in the same object. We see that akin to the way we start using materiality in digital environments. So physically based renderings to process scanned materials and operate in real-time rendered environments, simulate existing materials and allow for hybrids as a way to develop a sensibility to move across digital and physical contexts and allow the space to imagine future projections. So going back to the family album, this exhibition leveraged the ephemeral byproduct of scanning technologies, point clouds, and image making to explore 3 discarded sites across 3 basic building materials, stone, wood, and metal, with 3 elemental form-making strategies: line, plane, and volume, emphasizing many versus 3 iconic, really. Yes, it works through 3s, but the 3s are interchangeable and so forth. They are developed accelerating the heterogeneous, often country set of evidences for their context. So how do we weave these technologies into new classifications? Standing in as the initial site of investigation in the development of our projects are these digital material worlds. We call them worlds because, different than textures that you get out of scans and you just take them for granted, they do contain worlds. So rather than treating the unfolded textures of a given site as static, objective content, we begin by articulating possible spatial interventions, leveraging their pixels as the smallest building brick again. Engaging with the materiality that each of those pixels originally depicts, these allow for a more flexible relationship with them, rather than mere emulation. So the hierarchy of the initial content is flattened, conceptually but also literally, meaning if every coordinate is a vertice and every vertice is a color, what happens if you flatten all of these conditions into one? This displaces the pixel values to be spatially reassembled, right? The intention here is to construct a design sensibility that is able to negotiate the complex relationships on site without falling back into existing patterns. Or if you fall back into existing patterns, at least do it knowingly. As a way to begin to inhabit these design investigations, situated between hyperreal photography and gaming aesthetics. These image worlds connect the digital content of the initial scans with their projective design. Multiple narratives are embedded into the construction of these images through the insertion of various levels of resolution in the elements that they depict. The high-resolution scanned sites are treated as background point clouds, temporary snapshots of the environment we begin to inhabit. Bike seats, wildflowers, and ants are standing in with high-resolution materialities, foregrounding narratives of human and non-humans alike. The space in between these two conditions is occupied by architectural interventions, off-center, partaking in this conversation, jumping in and out of focus. Another quote, just because. In Hito Styles' words, quote, "A transitional space that allows people to enter and exit images, to freeze and become images, and then leave the state of flatness again and go somewhere else," unquote. Engaging with 3 different materialities, stone, steel, and at least the transparency of glass, these models are not intended to operate as direct representations of their respective design. So while there's obviously a relationship between the projects I showed before, they rather attempt to renegotiate basic architectural formal strategies, the line, the plane, the volume, to articulate these spatial interventions in these complex scanned sites, or more simply, how to develop a conversation between known architectural elements and the endlessly detailed data sets of 3D scanned environments is more in the foreground for this show. So, linear extrusions negotiating the often ripped edge condition of the scan, progressive layers of ink separating the dense point clouds through planar imaging, almost like a brain scan, and the stratification of physical points, which in the case of this model is actual layers of Italian granular sand hardened in a volumetric rock, suspended in between liquid and hardened states. So don't do this to it, essentially. The digitally captured environments of these 3 sites are imported in the space of the gallery. And thank you to Gene and his team who made a photogrammetry model, ad hoc photogrammetry model of your exhibition space. And as I explained to the exhibition team on Saturday, I mean, it was interesting to us because it starts talking about the space between the points. But if you're not familiar with the techniques of scanning, white and glass is the worst kind of materiality to scan because essentially it cannot read it as a solid state, right? So everything kind of becomes liquefied and explodes, which was very useful for us. If you want to go for the depictions of the real, then keep that in mind. So leveraging immersive imaging technologies of 360 videos, a continuation of the initial cloud experiment, right? Maybe. The individual animated clouds begin to intermingle, ceasing to be easily distinguishable and constructing a new environment in the space of the gallery. The viewer positioned across this landscape, orbiting around, can begin to construct novel modes of engagement across physical and digital realms. And through this medium of the video, the parts of the exhibition are essentially stitched together. the most low-tech video I'm showing today. So these, as mentioned, series of viewing platforms are deployed throughout the gallery, each engaging with different sections of the exhibit. The 360 environments are meant to be experienced with your mobile device, allowing each visitor to develop individual narratives of the space. Depending on which phone you're using, you have to activate your QR code reader or not. So standing in the center of the viewing platform, you can scan the code, navigate to the relative web page, and then line your device and work yourself through the cloud environment overlaying the real environment. And I'm saying this not out of the high pitch of a question was not due to insecurity this time. It was really because the intention of the exhibition is challenging you guys to start thinking about, what does that even mean, real? So once the video is playing, you'll be able to orbit around with your phone and view the whole 360 environment, the animation, but also the world depicted behind it. Keep in mind that these are, and we talked a little bit to in individual conversations about these. These are intentionally different than, the AR environment where you have a plan drawing and like a very simple house. There's always sort of the idea of the democracy of the image. Who can see it if you can only see that animation with that one very expensive iPad? And we wanted to have everyone experience the, I don't know, multiple hundreds of thousand points that we collected. Anyways, I think we're moving over there, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Maya. That was wonderful. I can't wait to scan the gallery with my phone. So everyone's going to get an opportunity to, I guess, use the exhibit is a way to put it. But first, we're going to make our way over to the cafe in front of the exhibit and make some comments and take some questions from the audience. So if you can, thank you, Maya, again, and we will convene just in the cafe.